As we then recenter into the downswing, is that applies a huge amount of force down into this foot, which then has the opposite effect of allowing this to rotate and then extend. All right, mate, so let's talk about the secret to rotating the hips, right?
Yep.
We get a lot of players very clickbaity of trying to get more rotation through impact. We see from the down the line view at the moment of impact, the professional golfer, they would tend to have their hips about 30 degrees open, right?
Correct.
If this is square, we would see the lead hip tend to move back and behind, the trail hip move in towards the golf ball, and that would help facilitate shaft lean. Now, a lot of players are trying to do that from a position in which is not going to facilitate good contact.
Correct.
They're out of position in the backswing, right? So I want you to talk to me about a common pattern that you see with amateur golfers, specifically with what they do in the backswing, that doesn't allow them to get into this position at the moment of impact.
It's a good point, and we definitely see a lot of students just not really getting, let's say, this right hip back enough. For the most part, with what I would see with a lot of students, they tend to get the right hip sliding across where they get the right hip pocket outside of the right heel. And they basically got way too much pressure and way too much of their body mass over to the right side.
Yeah, we can see that generally. We're going to see that with this sort of look, that back foot's kind of rolled outwards.
Exactly. And the recovery time, in the downswing, or let's say the downswing move happens in a third of the time of the backswing. So there's literally no recovery time when they're out of position. So that's one of the things I always try and explain to my students is the time that you have going forward is much less going back. So we need to be in position. We need to be prepared to actually make some sort of move. And often we will see the move, but again, they're coming from a position that's so far across that they just can't recover in time.
Yeah. So if I was to set up to a golf ball, and we'll use this stick here, which is going to indicate like ball position, right? Come over here on my right side and kind of show me what you would see with a player who isn't able to get into this nice rotated position at impact, as we were just discussing. They would tend to shift outwards in this direction, you would say?
Exactly. So if I put a shaft just slightly outside your right hip, they're going to bust through that. They're going to kind of knock it. It's going to go way outside of that. If we put a line just out to the right hip, they're blasting through that.
Yeah. And we can see as I do so, then this foot very much so rolling out. I feel a lot of pressure on the outstep there, and that's going to inhibit our ability to get this trail leg lengthening as such.
Correct.
Right.
Exactly right.
What would the professional do who does get rotated at the moment of impact? What would they do with their hips?
So from, let's say, a more optimal position at the top, let's say where they're starting to already get a sense at the top of the weight starting to move left, even though it's not quite there yet. They're in a position from here where they're starting to sort of fall into the left side. They can start to rotate more easily from this position.
Yeah. And I would say like a big part of that is allowing your body to rotate enough in the backswing helps sequence up that downswing move, right?
Absolutely.
So if I don't rotate properly, I don't let this trail leg lengthen, let's say I keep it flexed, my arms are going to tend to lift. And then as I begin to try and turn, well, essentially we've got no room, right? So the real amateur golfer will hit across the golf ball a lot.
Correct.
Or a better player, they might start to add a little bit of right side bend.
Yep.
But both of these essentially is
Really
time and space. It's not going to be very efficient whatsoever.
Correct.
So allowing from the setup position, this trail hip to kind of move back enough to the point where as we're about to swing down, we're almost feeling that weight is shifting back to the trail side. It's certainly not on the outstep of that back foot whatsoever.
Right. And the position that you're in there is also pretty important as it relates to the right foot. Just having a little bit of flare in the right foot can definitely open up the hip joint, especially if you're not too flexible in the hip flexors, and just allows for this leg to lengthen, allows for that trail hip to pull back way more easily.
Yeah. And we see with a lot of senior golfers who might have tight hip flexors, actually just from this straight setup here, dropping that right foot back a little bit, very much so allows that to lengthen as well. So plenty of drills out there in regards to dropping the trail foot back is going to open those hips up enough, which will then facilitate that more in-sequence downswing that we see.
Definitely gives them a good head start.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say that we do get ourselves into this functional position. We really haven't swayed off the ball too much. We've allowed this to lengthen. What's a great drill or feeling in that transition to ensure that we're able to get this image that we were discussing at the beginning of the video?
So I'll always look at what this lead hip's doing from a standpoint of the downward nature of the hip and forward nature of the hip. I'd say if a student just stays too much this way, they're in trouble, say too closed. And as you mentioned, if they're turning sort of on the back foot, that doesn't also work.
Yeah.
So often we'll do some little movements with a student where we'll actually get them to kind of step and push down into this lead hip this way. So I always like to do little exercises like this. So they have to get some pressure forward and they have to move some pressure down. So as soon as they get into this position where, let's say in the transition, left arm parallel, they'll get their hips back to a more square look and they can keep pushing up and through that left side a lot more easily than if they didn't get to the left side, a lot more easily than if they just stayed like closed.
Yeah, correct. And I feel like a common fault with a lot of players is when they are trying to get their hips forward and open, they do it in a bumping fashion where the lead hip gets high.
Exactly.
That stops this downward pressure into the ground, which then helps facilitate that rotation. Whereas if we look at the pelvis at the top of the swing, we'll see that the trail hip will get higher than the lead due to the fact that the trail leg has straightened, which then as we then recenter into the downswing, now we can see exactly what Steve was saying there, is that applies a huge amount of force down into this foot, which then has the opposite effect of allowing this to rotate and then extend.
Absolutely.
Right? So I suppose coupling this together and tying a bow on it for the guys at home, it's more about giving yourself the ability and the time to do that in the downswing through creating more rotation rather than lateral sway, and then just getting the sensation from the top that we are applying force down into the lead foot. And it feels like I'm really driving that pressure down, and as a result, it frees up that lower body to kind of clear out there.
Exactly. There's definitely that lengthening process of the hip allows you to pull up and back way more easily than if you didn't get pressure there.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to note it's not very forceful in any way. I'm not trying to rip this thing back and then rip it back in that direction, which I feel like a lot of amateurs fall in the habit of doing so. It's more of an athletic movement. You mentioned little step drills there. If I'm just feeling like I'm moving around a little bit, that little step there kind of allows my body to free up and lengthen. If I was to step forward, now all of a sudden we can see that pressure down. So just being aware of that, I think, is very important as well.
I agree. Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to have a small little swing, feeling that the trail leg is lengthening. It's not swaying. I'm aware that I'm not shifting my pressure out onto that trail foot. And then I'm just going to rehearse this first little downswing piece of feeling a little bit more pressure down into the lead foot. Let's blend it into a full shot, see how it looks. Mate, came out, divot after the golf ball.
That was the best one so far.
Cheers.